Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Wildcard Wednesday. It is May 20th, 2026, and I'm Stacy Buck, President and Senior Consultant. So I'm back after a couple weeks of not sharing on social media. It was a crazy 2 weeks, and very few days went as they were planned, but I am back this week with two cases for us to take a look at. So let's go ahead and jump into case number one. So this case was sent into me with the CTA results that were performed like on the same day. So we do see that imaging was performed on the same day as the intervention. The patient was referred for the intervention because of the results on the CTA. So I'm not going to go through the CTA report. We see that there, was some diagnostic information on the CTA, but I want to jump into the actual operative report itself. So if we look here at the history or the indication, it mentions that the patient is referred for angiogram and possible interventions. So even though the patient had a prior CTA, based on that particular statement, for right now, I'm going to go ahead and allow the diagnostic angiography to be coded in this case. However, I will say this, I would prefer to see very clear documentation about the medical necessity for performing the catheter-based angiography, given that the CTA was performed on the same day for this patient. So that's probably going to be a judgment call on your end, like how strict you want to be on the documentation requirements to assign that imaging code or not. But again, because it says possible interventions, I'm going to go ahead and allow it. So I will discuss that with you during this case. So first we see the sedation is documented in the report. So you'll see that I have the appropriate sedation codes there. Obviously, if you're coding for facility versus prophy, you're not going to get the add-on code on the prophy side, but if you are billing for the entire time, there was a typo in the report that I changed. I believe it was 128 minutes was the intended time in the report that was submitted. Then when we jump down into the actual details of the procedure, we see that at the beginning of the procedure, we have the vessel access that right common femoral artery under ultrasound guidance, and we do have our documentation to report 76937. Then after the physician gained access into that right common femoral, the catheter was advanced into the distal abdominal aorta and an angiogram was performed. So at that point, the catheterization code would be 36200, but obviously as the case continues, that code is going to be bundled with the selective catheterization code, and then eventually with the lower extremity intervention, the selective catheterization code is going to be bundled. So here it mentions that an angiogram was performed, but we don't actually see any diagnostic findings mentioned here, nor do we see, I'm sorry, we don't see any diagnostic findings here. When we get into the next paragraph where we see the catheter is then moved into the left common femoral artery, an angiogram is performed, then we start to see some findings tied to the intervention that was performed. Now, when we're looking at this report and we're analyzing what potentially we could code, let's stop and look at that statement about the catheter being placed in the distal abdominal aorta and an angiogram being performed. If you listen to past episodes of Wildcard Wednesday, I've talked about the requirements for a 75625 and a 75630. So for those of you who maybe haven't listened to past episodes, I will go through it again. I think it bears repeating. And this is something that all coders should be reminded of. So when we're looking at considering code 75625, what you want to see documented in a perfect world after the contrast is injected, you would see findings for the origins of the renal arteries, the superior mesenteric, the inferior mesenteric, and the celiac, and then of course the abdominal aorta itself. So if you don't see all of those documented, then you really don't have a true 75625. And that same documentation actually applies to the 75630, which is the runoff study. You need to see all the documentation you would for a 75625 plus findings of the lower extremities down to the level of the common femoral like arteries. So That's what's required when we're considering 75625 versus 75630. And there's also the consideration of, was the imaging done from one catheter placement high in the aorta, or was it done from two separate catheter placements, one catheter high in the aorta and one down at the bifurcation? So right here, just looking at the statement without even looking at any diagnostic findings, the fact that the catheter was placed in the distal abdominal aorta, right there, that tells us that we're not going to be assigning a 75625, and we're not going to be assigning a 75630 because an aortogram is not being performed. The catheter is actually there at that bifurcation, and the contrast is injected to visualize the extremities. So we know we're going to have an extremity code. The question is, are we going to have a bilateral? Are we going to have a unilateral? Are we going to have any add-on codes there? When we go into the next paragraph, the catheter is placed in the left common femoral, and then an angiogram was performed there. And so when we get over to the second page of the report, I'll just jump ahead here into the findings. We see the different findings from the contrast injections. So let's look at those quickly before we go back into the report. So in the first paragraph under findings, it mentions the abdominal aortogram, and it says it demonstrates a patent distal abdominal aorta, bilateral common iliac arteries, and external iliac arteries. And then it says there's moderate stenosis of the left external iliac artery and the common femoral artery. So with this here, going back to 75630, that code, why would I not assign that? Because the catheter was at the distal abdominal aorta. We only have findings for distal abdominal aorta. So we cannot report 75630, even though we see this runoff that occurred into the lower extremities. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to look to assign the imaging code when the catheter was moved into that left common femoral artery there. And I'm going to code the 75710, the unilateral, which you saw documented in the report. So why did I not code a 75716? Well, when we're looking at the findings, we see that on the left side, we had findings of the left external iliac artery into the common femoral on the left, but there's nothing mentioned about the right beyond those iliac arteries. So that's why I'm not picking that up. And we also know that the focus is on the left extremity as well. So as far as the imaging is concerned, I'm only assigning a 75710 for the imaging that occurred from that catheter placement in the left common femoral artery. Then from there, we are given some information about the findings. Noted was a totally occluded left superficial femoral artery. So we know we're going to code this as a complex lesion. Then when we look into the next paragraph, we see an atherectomy was performed of that SFA, and also the drug-eluting stent was placed, and then angioplasty was also performed. And so the code for that work for a complex lesion is 37277. Then when we go into the next paragraph, we see a laser atherectomy of the tibioperineal trunk being performed, and then also an angioplasty was performed as well. And so if we're going to come down and look at the findings here, what we see with these other vessels is we actually see that we have a, excuse me, let me clear my throat and take a drink, that we have a stenosis that is documented in these other vessels that are being treated. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to code the rest of these as a straightforward lesion, and we're not going to be coding them as complex because they're documented with stenosis. So I'm kind of jumping ahead to the findings, and now we're jumping back here. So we have 37288 for that TP trunk intervention that occurred. And then here in our next paragraph, we're almost at the bottom of the report. We have a shockwave balloon advanced into the left common femoral artery, and then lithotripsy was performed to that left common femoral. So that's going to give us our add-on code 37279 for the lithotripsy that was performed. And then we also see here the shockwave balloon was pulled back into the left external iliac artery, and then the IVL was performed to the external iliac. And we cannot assign the add-on code in this particular scenario because there was no other intervention in the iliac territory, and the 37262 needs a primary code. So what I would recommend in this situation is actually reporting this lithotripsy with the unlisted code 37799 because we don't have a corresponding primary code. And I kind of like consider this scenario sort of similar to when we're doing the head and neck angiography and we have add-on code 36227 for the external carotids. Sometimes, they will go directly to the external carotid, inject contrast, and then do imaging. Well, we can't assign that add-on code because it needs a primary code, and we code that work as like unlisted. And so whenever you're doing work in the lower extremities with these like new codes and you're lacking a code for something, whether it be, in this case, a primary code, you can't assign the lithotripsy code without a primary code, or if maybe you see an atherectomy being performed in the inframalleolar territory or lithotripsy in the tibial perineal territory, I would lean towards doing unlisted codes, the 37799 for those procedures. So that's my choice there because we don't have anything to attach it to, even using a modifier 22 on something. Because it's a different territory. Like I wouldn't even recommend putting that in any of the other codes. So I feel most comfortable going with the unlisted there. So that is the coding of the first case there. Okay, so let's go on to our second case. So this is also a lower extremity like intervention. And so sent in with the actual operative report was information from the consult note. And the consult note says, presents today for angiography with right lower extremity intervention due to recurrent slow healing, right lower extremity wounds, and a known right popliteal artery occlusion on most recent angiographic imaging. So based on this statement, I'm actually not going to recommend coding the imaging. I would want to see a statement about the decision to intervene being based on the catheter-based study, but I'm not comfortable coding it with what is stated here because it says angiography with intervention. There's a known popliteal artery occlusion. So here we can already look at our report under the description of procedure. We have been given some findings. So we see that we have 100% occlusion in our popliteal, 100% occlusion in the TP trunk. So we know we're going to be looking at our complex codes there. And then we have, in the posterior tibial, there's a stenosis straightforward with angioplasty. So let's take a look at this report here. So when we get into the details, we have that ultrasound guided vascular access being performed. We've got our documentation requirements here. So we're going to assign a 76937, and then the physician gains access into the left common femoral artery. And then from there, the catheter gets advanced to the right superficial femoral artery. So now we're in the contralateral extremity. And then angiography of the right popliteal shows, again, that 100% occlusion that they're aware of, 100% occluded TP trunk, 100% occluded proximal perineal artery, and then the proximal posterior tibial is stenotic. So looking at this, what we want to consider is that we see this popliteal artery occluded in the TP trunk, and then we also see angioplasty performed across the popliteal, tibioperineal trunk, and the proximal PTA. So looking at this report, it appears to me that this is a single lesion that spans all of these vessels. So is it possible that they're separate lesions? Maybe, but highly unlikely that they are. I would want to see detail in the report showing that they are distinct and separate lesions to be able to assign a code for the popliteal, and then also to be able to assign a code for that tibial and perineal territory. So I'm going to consider this one lesion. And so when we have a single lesion that crosses two territories for 2026, CPT tells us that we code the most distal territory. So we are actually going to code this with a code from the tibial and perineal territory. And because this is a single lesion and one of the vessels, had a straightforward lesion and one had complex, but we're treating it as a single lesion, we're going to make this complex. So we end up with the code being 37282 for the angioplasty that was performed in these three vessels. And so though I only have two codes for this case, the 37282 and then also the 76937. So hopefully it helped you to have a discussion of these cases today. I think I have two more cases on deck in my inbox before I run out of cases. So if you have any cases that you would like to submit for Wildcard Wednesday, please do so, and I will get to them in a future edition. Thank you for tuning in and have a great rest of your week.